Let me start by telling you who this video is for. If you stopped going to church and you're wondering about your kid's faith, this is for you. If you still go to church, but you want to be more intentional about shaping your kid's faith, this is for you too. Okay, this is part 2 of a series on raising your kids with faith, especially if you don't go to church. And the reason we're talking about it is because, well, it's a question that I get pretty often. Hey, we stopped going to church, but now what about our kids? And listen, this channel isn't about trying to get you to go back. It's about what your faith looks like going forward. In the last video, we talked about the environment or the container that you're raising your kids in and how that impacts their faith formation. But in this video, we're going to talk more specifically about the content of that container. What do I actually say to them? And how do I say it? Personally, I find it comforting to know that that's not actually a new question. It's one that religious people have been wondering about for centuries, long before churches even existed. So let's draw on some of that ancient wisdom. The first part comes from an ancient poem called Psalm 78. In this poem, the author, a Jewish man named Asaph, he names a family regret and resolution. The regret is the reality of what happens when you're careless about the container you raise your kids in, careless about the environment you create. The resolution is what he hopes the readers will resolve to do instead. He says, "I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from our descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commandments. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God and whose spirits were not faithful to him." Asaph would say the content within the container or environment we're raising our kids in, the content should include telling our kids what God did and teaching them what God commands. Now, here's why this was so important to Asaph. He doesn't want to see history repeat itself. This is what he spends the rest of the poem laying out. He lays out his family history. And in that history, God rescued his ancestors from slavery in Egypt to live a new kind of free life. Now, what you need to understand is that during that time in history, humanity was guided by some basic barbaric values. First, might makes right. If I'm the most powerful, I get to make the rules. And second, other people are mostly objects who exist for my own purpose or pleasure so long as I'm in power. The idea of human dignity or the inherent value of every individual, those were non-existent. That's why Asaph's ancestors ended up as slaves in Egypt in the first place. But into that world, Asaph's God, Yahweh, steps in and takes this dehumanized group and frees them from slavery. And then he gives them laws that are all designed to show them what it means to be human again. I know often the Old Testament laws can sound really backwards to us, but when you read them in their historical context, they were really revolutionary. They were benevolent and gracious. Something that, if lived out, the entire world would have taken notice of. It would attract the poor and marginalized. It would provide stability in society and challenge the powerful. So Asaph says, hey, we need to tell our kids what God did so that they can know that they can trust God. And then we need to teach them those revolutionary commands so that they can truly know what it means to be human. Tell your kid what God did and teach them to follow God's ways for how to be human. Unlike my ancestors, says Asaph. Rather than tell the story of God's salvation and live according to his rules for life, Asaph's ancestors rebelled against God. They ignored his rules for life, and they opted for the barbaric ways of their neighbors, and it always ended badly. Kids got sacrificed. Women and children got treated like objects. The poor were pushed aside and taken advantage of. The powerful abused the weak. Don't be like them, says Asaph. Tell your kid what God did and teach them God's way to be human. Because if we don't, we'll end up doing what our ancestors did and walk away from God to our own and to our children's detriment. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Corey, I don't even remember all 10 commandments, let alone 400 plus other laws in the Old Testament. And do I really need to know and teach my kid all of that, as well as all those stories? Like, golly, that's a big book, man. How am I supposed to do all of that? I mean, if that's what it takes to raise faith in my kids, I mean, I'm out. But hold on. To help manage that, here's some more ancient wisdom. This comes from Deuteronomy 6. The author is about to lay out all those rules and regulations for life, and here's what he advises. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Look, don't take any of that literally. I want you to really hear what's going on underneath. Sit, walk, lie down. Hands that you use for everything. Foreheads that you see on every person you talk to. Door frames when you enter or exit your house. Gates when you enter or exit your property. These are all symbols of the natural rhythms of life. Things you do every day that the author is inviting his readers to turn into rituals. In other words, incorporate these stories and commands into what you're already doing. Going to church was just one ritual infused with spiritual significance. But the reality is, you can turn any rhythm into a meaningful ritual. Meals are a perfect time to practice gratitude to God and connection with one another, learning to listen lovingly to each other as God does to us. Bedtime rhythms can easily become rituals that incorporate a simple Bible story or a prayer or a song that help children know and understand God's love for them. It might be worth sitting down and writing out what you'd like your child's faith to include. What do you want it to look like? What do you want them to know about God and about Jesus? Write that stuff down. And then consider incorporating those things into your already existing rhythms. Create meaningful rituals as a family. And listen, if all of this feels like a lot, I get it. I'm like you. I surf Instagram Reels and TikTok videos of parents who are absolutely crushing it. I watch Bluey with my kids and feel like my parenting pales in comparison to that dog dad with all of his creative games and endless energy for his kids. And now I've got to create rituals and make sure they know all the stories. I mean, I'm barely hanging on as it is. It's so easy to feel like a failure as a parent, right? Especially when it comes to raising faith in our kids. If that's how you feel, then you're definitely going to want to watch part 3, because that's exactly what we'll address next. Thanks for hanging out. We'll see you next time.